The horse, a sturdy buckskin mare named Dust, picked her way down the rutted track that bled into the main street of Gallows Hollow. Elijah sat tall in the saddle, a stillness about him that seemed to absorb the weary afternoon sun. He wore the trail like a second skin, a coat of fine, pale dirt on his worn leather chaps, his hat brim pulled low against the glare, and a look in his gray eyes that held the vast, lonely distances of the prairie. Gallows Hollow was dying. It was not a quick or noble death, but a slow, festering rot. The town clung to the side of a gouged-out mountain like a scab, its timber buildings bleached and splintered under the relentless sky. The promise of gold that had birthed it had long since soured, leaving behind a residue of desperation. What little ore was left was choked out of the earth by Hannigan Mining, a name branded on the largest building in town, a name that felt more like a threat than a promise. Dust settled on everything, a fine grit that coated the tongue and dulled the senses. Elijah's gaze swept the street, reading the town's story in a single pass. He saw men leaning against saloon posts, their shoulders slumped with the weight of cheap whiskey and broken dreams. Their eyes, when they lifted to watch him pass, were a mixture of dull resentment and fleeting curiosity. He saw women who scurried from the general store to their small, sun-beaten homes, their faces pinched with worry, clutching their shawls and their children close. They did not look at the saloon men, and they did not look at him. They looked at the ground, as if searching for a path that did not exist. The sheriff's office was a small, sad-looking building with a sagging porch. Through the window, Elijah could see a man tilted back in his chair, boots propped on a desk, a star pinned crookedly to his vest. He was a thick man, gone to seed, his face flushed. He did not stir as Elijah rode past. He was a piece of the town's decay, not a cure for it. This was a place where justice slept with one eye open, and only for the right price. Elijah was not here for justice, not the kind that men wrote about in books. He was here for a piece of paper that promised $200 for the delivery of Jedediah Tucker, wanted for robbery and murder. The poster said dead or alive, but Elijah preferred them breathing. It was cleaner that way. He had tracked Tucker for 3 weeks, a trail of stolen horses and empty bottles that led straight to this forgotten pocket of the world. A place like Gallows Hollow was perfect for a man like Tucker to disappear. It was a town that did not ask questions. He swung down from Dust in front of the livery, the scent of hay and manure a welcome relief from the street's stench of stale beer and misery. He handed the reins to a wiry old man with a suspicious squint. "Just for the night," Elijah said, his voice a low rasp, dry from the trail. "Give her a good rub down and a double ration of oats. She's earned it." The old man grunted, taking the reins without a word. Elijah pulled his saddlebags from the mare's back and slung them over his shoulder. He ran a hand down her flank, a silent promise he would be back, then turned toward the heart of the town. There was only one place to get a hot meal and a cold beer, and it was likely the same place a man like Jed Tucker would be found. The Golden Spur Saloon was loud before he even pushed through the batwing doors. The sound of a badly tuned piano fought with the roar of drunken voices, a cacophony of despair. The air inside was thick with smoke, sweat, and the cloying sweetness of spilled liquor. Miners, still covered in the grime of the day's labor, crowded the bar, their voices raw as they shouted over one another. A few tables were filled with hard-faced men playing cards, their eyes narrowed, their holsters heavy on their hips. Elijah moved to a small, shadowed table in the corner, a spot that gave him a clear view of the room and the door. He set his saddlebags down and sat with his back to the wall, a habit as natural to him as breathing. A harried-looking bartender eventually made his way over. "Whiskey," Elijah said. The bartender nodded, wiped the table with a dirty rag, and left. Elijah's gaze drifted over the faces in the crowd, sorting them, dismissing them. He was looking for Tucker's mean, rat-like features. But the man was not here, not yet. Then the piano player hit a series of chords, a clumsy introduction, and a hush fell over a small portion of the room. A woman walked onto the small, raised stage at the far end of the saloon. She was not beautiful in the way of fine ladies in catalogs, all soft edges and delicate smiles. Her beauty was harder, like a wildflower that had fought its way through rock to find the sun. She wore a dress of dark blue velvet that had seen better days. Its color faded, its hem frayed. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pinned up in a way that seemed both elegant and precarious, as if it might tumble down at any moment. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a deep, sad green, and they were utterly, devastatingly empty. She began to sing. Her voice was not the loud, brassy sort one expected in a place like this. It was clear and pure, a silver thread weaving through the thick, smoky air. The song was a mournful ballad of a lover lost at sea, a melody full of heartache and longing. For a few moments, the pure, clean sorrow of her voice silenced the room. Men stopped their shouting, their card games, their drinking, and they listened. They listened as if her song was telling the story of their own lost hopes. Elijah watched her, a strange ache tightening in his chest. She sang of a world far from this dusty, violent town, a world of deep water and endless skies. But her eyes never left Gallows Hollow. They were fixed on some distant point beyond the back wall, as if she were singing to a ghost. When the song ended, the spell broke. A ragged wave of applause and a few crude whistles filled the silence. The woman, Clara, gave a small, practiced curtsy, a ghost of a smile touching her lips but not her eyes. She stepped down from the stage, and the saloon's ugliness rushed back in to fill the space her music had cleared. She moved between the tables, a tray in her hand, collecting empty glasses. As she passed a table of miners, one of them, a big man with a florid face and a cruel mouth, reached out and grabbed her wrist. "Sing another one, sweetheart," he slurred, his grip tightening. "A happy one this time. I've had enough of sad stories." Clara tried to pull her arm away, her expression hardening. "Let go of me, Bart!" "Not till you promise to sing for me," he said, a sneer twisting his lips. He yanked her closer, spilling the remaining dregs of beer from the glasses on her tray onto the floor. "Or maybe you can offer me something else instead." A flicker of fire lit her empty eyes. "I'd sooner offer you a fist," she said, her voice low and tight, and with a speed that surprised the man. She slapped him hard across the face with her free hand. The sound cut through the noise of the room. The man, Bart, looked stunned for a moment. Then his face contorted with rage. He shoved her backward, hard. Clara stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a table. Before she could recover, a burly man who worked for the saloon, a bouncer with a broken nose and no neck, stormed over. He grabbed Clara by the upper arm, his fingers digging in cruelly. "You know the rules," he snarled, and began to drag her toward a door at the back of the saloon. She did not cry out or struggle. She simply went limp, her face a mask of stone, the fire in her eyes extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. Elijah was on his feet before he had made a conscious decision to move. He was not a man who went looking for trouble, but he was also not a man who could watch a hawk tear apart a sparrow and do nothing. He moved with a quiet, deadly grace, intercepting the bouncer and the woman before they reached the back door. He did not draw his gun. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood in their path, a solid, unmovable presence. "Let her go," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of iron. The bouncer glowered at him. "This ain't your business, stranger." Bart Hannigan, the man she had slapped, was on his feet now, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "He's right," Hannigan said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "The little songbird needs to be taught a lesson about respect." Elijah's gaze flickered from the bouncer to Hannigan, then back. He ignored the gun. He ignored the threat. "The lady is right here," he said, his voice still level. "You could try asking her with respect. See if that gets you a song." A few men chuckled. Hannigan's face darkened. He was not used to being challenged, much less mocked. Elijah looked at the bouncer. "You can let her go now, or I can help you. I suspect you'll like one of those choices more than the other." There was no threat in his tone, just a statement of fact. But the bouncer saw something in Elijah's cold, gray eyes that made him hesitate. He saw a man who had seen worse things than a saloon brawl, a man who measured his actions with careful, lethal precision. The bouncer's grip loosened. Clara pulled her arm free. She looked at Elijah, but there was no gratitude in her gaze, only a deep, weary suspicion. Her eyes, which had held a universe of sorrow while she sang, were now shuttered, closed off. She looked at him as if he were just another man trying to stake a claim on her, another problem she would eventually have to solve. Without a word, she turned and walked away. Not back into the main room, but through a different door that led toward the saloon's kitchen. Hannigan took a step forward, his hand still on his gun. "You just made a mistake, friend." Elijah finally turned his full attention to him. He let his gaze travel down from Hannigan's face to his hand, then back up. He did not look impressed. "I make them all the time," he said softly. "It's how I learn." He turned his back on Hannigan, a deliberate, calculated insult, and walked back to his table. He sat down, picked up the whiskey the bartender had brought, and took a long, slow swallow. The saloon was quiet for a moment, the air thick with tension. Then, slowly, the noise started up again, a little more subdued than before. Hannigan stared at Elijah's back for a long moment, his jaw tight, before spitting on the floor and storming out of the saloon, his cronies trailing behind him. Elijah finished his whiskey and ordered another. He had not prevented the violence. He had only postponed it, and he had painted a target on his own back in the process. He found a room at a boarding house down the street, a place that smelled of boiled cabbage and dust. The room was small and clean enough, with a lumpy bed and a pitcher of water that had a film on its surface. The woman who ran the place, a thin, bird-like creature named Mrs. Gable, watched him with nervous eyes as he signed the register. "You're the one from the saloon," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "The one who stood up to Bart Hannigan." Elijah just nodded, not offering any more. "You should be careful," she went on, unable to stop herself. "That boy is poison, just like his father. They own this town, body and soul." She leaned closer, her voice dropping even lower. "And you should stay away from that saloon singer, too. Clara, she's trouble of a different kind." "Is that so?" Elijah asked, his tone giving nothing away. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Gable said, warming to her subject, a hint of vicious satisfaction in her tone. "A fallen woman, that one. Thinks she's too good for this town, with her sad songs and her proud airs. But we all know what she is. Used goods, not worth saving." Elijah looked at the woman, at her pinched face and her self-righteous certainty. He saw in her the town's cruel heart, the way it judged and condemned, the way it took its own misery and heaped it upon those who were most vulnerable. He said nothing. He simply took his key, picked up his saddlebags, and went up to his room. He did not need the landlady to tell him that Bart Hannigan was the mine owner's son. It was written all over him, the arrogance, the entitlement, the casual cruelty of a man who had never been told no. Elijah had spent the rest of the evening at the saloon, nursing a beer and listening. It was not hard to learn the rest. He learned how Hannigan and his men had been squeezing the life out of the valley, forcing small-time ranchers to sell their land for pennies on the dollar by diverting water sources or running off their cattle. He heard whispers of women who worked at the saloon, young women who found themselves trapped in deals with Hannigan, deals that left them with nothing but shame. The sheriff, a man named Cutler, was on the Hannigan payroll. Everyone knew it. No one did anything about it. Gallows Hollow was a company town, and Bart Hannigan was its prince. Later that night, sleep did not come easy. The lumpy mattress and the stale air were part of it, but the true cause lay deeper, when he finally drifted off. The old dream came for him, as it always did when he was weary and his guard was down. He was standing in a field of wildflowers, the sun warm on his face. His wife, Sarah, was there, her laughter like the sound of wind chimes. She was weaving a crown of daisies for their son, Thomas, a small boy with his mother's smile and a shock of blonde hair. The boy ran toward him, his small legs pumping, his arms outstretched. "Papa!" But as Elijah reached for him, the sky turned a bruised, angry orange. The smell of smoke filled the air, acrid and choking. The wildflowers turned to ash at his feet. He turned, and his cabin, the one he had built with his own 2 hands, was engulfed in flames. He could hear Sarah screaming his name, a sound that was ripped from her throat. He could hear the boy crying. He ran, but his feet were stuck in thick mud. He was moving through molasses, the fire roaring in his ears, the heat searing his skin. He saw the faces of the raiders in the firelight, their grins like gashes in the dark, their eyes lit with a terrible glee. He had been out hunting, too far away to hear them coming. By the time he saw the smoke, it was too late. He woke with a gasp, his heart pounding against his ribs, the phantom smell of smoke still in his nostrils. The room was dark and silent, but the screams were still echoing in his head. He had hunted down 2 of the men responsible. He had watched them die, but it had not brought him peace. It had not silenced the screams. It had only hollowed him out, leaving a cold, hard knot of grief and failure where his heart used to be. He had failed to protect them. He had failed to get justice for them. And since that day, he had kept his heart locked away, a cold, dead thing he no longer knew how to use. He rose from the bed and walked to the window, pushing aside the thin curtain. The moon was high, casting long shadows down the empty street of Gallows Hollow. The town was asleep, but its nightmares were wide awake. He saw Clara's face in his mind, the emptiness in her eyes. He saw the way she had looked at him, with suspicion instead of hope. She knew, better than most, that saviors rarely came to towns like this. More often than not, they were just another kind of wolf. The next morning, Elijah rose before the sun. He needed to find out if Jed Tucker had any connection to the Hannigan operation. A man like Bart Hannigan always had use for hired guns. He walked past the Golden Spur on his way to the livery to check on his horse. The front of the saloon was closed and quiet, but he heard a sound coming from the alley that ran along its side, the rhythmic scrape of a stiff brush against wood. He slowed his steps, his curiosity piqued. He peered into the dim light of the alley. It was Clara. She was on her hands and knees, scrubbing at a dark stain on the wooden planks of the back stoop. She wore a simple, patched dress, and her beautiful hair was tied back in a messy knot. She moved with a grim, methodical determination, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. As she shifted her weight, the morning light caught her hands. Her knuckles were swollen and bruised, the skin split and bleeding in several places. It was the punishment he had postponed. It had found her anyway. In the dark, after the saloon had closed, where there were no strangers to interfere. She did not see him. He stood in the shadows for a long moment, watching her. He saw the set of her jaw, the rigid line of her back. He saw a pride that refused to be broken, a strength that was being worn down, day by day, insult by insult. The men of this town saw a fallen woman. Elijah saw a soldier in a war she could not win, who still refused to surrender. He felt the old, familiar rage rise in him, cold and sharp, but he pushed it down. Raging at the world had done nothing for Sarah and Thomas. It would do nothing for this woman. He turned and walked away before she could see him, his boots silent on the dusty ground. He went to the general store, which was just opening for the day. He bought a small, round tin of Doctor, Thatcher's carbolic salve, good for cuts, burns, and bruises. Then he walked back to the alley. Clara was gone, but her bucket and brush remained. The dark stain on the wood was lighter now, but not gone. It never really went away. He walked over to the stoop and placed the small tin of salve right next to the bucket, where she would be sure to find it when she came back for her things. He did not leave a note. He did not wait for her to return. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a promise of salvation. It was just a small tin of medicine, left in the dark for a woman with wounded hands, and for a man whose heart had been locked for years. It was more than he had offered anyone in a long, long time. The hunt for Jedediah Tucker was like tracking a ghost through a graveyard. The man had vanished into the cracks of Gallows Hollow, and the town held its secrets tight. Elijah spent 2 days listening, watching, and asking questions that were not quite questions. He learned to read the silences, the quick glances between men at the bar, the way a subject was changed too abruptly. He nursed cheap whiskey and bought drinks for men whose faces were maps of disappointment. It was an old, rheumy-eyed prospector named Silas who finally gave him the peace he was looking for. Silas had lost a lung to the dust in Hannigan's mine and now spent his days nursing a bottle and a cough that shook his frail body. Elijah found him sitting alone, staring into the bottom of an empty glass. He slid a full one in front of him. "Much obliged, stranger," Silas rasped, his hand trembling as he reached for it. "Looking for a man," Elijah said, his voice low. "Goes by Jed Tucker, mean-looking fellow, scar above his right eye." Silas took a long swallow of the whiskey, his eyes watering. He shook his head slowly. "Ain't seen him." But his eyes flickered toward the back room of the saloon, the one reserved for Hannigan's private games. It was a movement so slight it was barely there, but Elijah saw it. "Heard he might be looking for work." Elijah pressed gently. "The kind of work a man with a gun is good for." Silas finished the whiskey in another gulp. He coughed, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to come from his very soul. "If a man like that was looking for that kind of work," he wheezed, wiping his mouth with the back of a skeletal hand, "he'd find it with Bart Hannigan. Hannigan's got a few associates, men who ain't on the company payroll, men who help him persuade folks to see things his way." He looked up at Elijah, his old eyes filmed with a mixture of fear and bitterness. "That's all I know, and that's more than it's safe to know in this town." Silas pushed himself up from the table and shuffled away, leaving Elijah with the confirmation he needed. Tucker wasn't just hiding in Gallows Hollow. He was being sheltered. He was working, and that made the bounty far more complicated and far more dangerous. That evening, Elijah sat in the saloon again, at his corner table. He was tired of the taste of cheap whiskey, so he ordered a bowl of stew. It was Clara who brought it to him. She moved with a practiced efficiency, her face a carefully composed mask of neutrality. She set the bowl down in front of him without a word. Her hands were wrapped in thin strips of white cloth, covering the raw knuckles. "Thank you," Elijah said. She paused, her hand hovering over the table for just a second. She seemed surprised that he had spoken. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice quiet and formal. She started to turn away. "The salve," he said, his voice just as quiet. "Did it help?" Her shoulders stiffened. She turned back to face him, and for the first time, the mask slipped. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, confusion, suspicion, and beneath it all, a faint, wounded gratitude. She did not understand the gesture. In her world, nothing came without a price. "My hands are my own business," she said. Her tone clipped, but there was no real heat in it. It was the reply of a creature long accustomed to defending itself. "Just so," Elijah agreed, and he picked up his spoon and turned his attention to the stew. He did not press her further. He did not demand thanks. He simply ate his meal. From the corner of his eye, he saw her linger for another moment before she finally walked away, her back straight and proud. The stew was thin, but it was hot. As he ate, he listened to the talk around him. He heard Clara's name mentioned at a nearby table. It was Mrs. Gable, his landlady, speaking in a conspiratorial whisper to another townswoman. "Such a shame," Mrs. Gable was saying, though her voice held no sympathy. "Her father, you know, good man, Thomas, died in the number 3 shaft collapse 5 years back. Left her with nothing but his debts. And she's been paying them off at the Golden Spur ever since," the other woman added, her tone thick with meaning. "Paying Mr. Sterling, the owner, in every way he asks. I'd wager she puts on such airs," Mrs. Gable continued, "as if she's better than the rest of us, but a woman who sings for drunkards and serves them liquor, well, she's no better than she ought to be." Elijah kept eating, his expression unchanging, but the words settled like stones in his gut. He pictured Clara as a young girl, her father swallowed by the same mountain that now held the whole town captive. He imagined her grief, followed by the cold, hard reality of debt. She had not chosen this life. It had been chosen for her. She had been sold, and the town, instead of offering her compassion, offered her only its contempt. The cold came down from the mountains after the sun set, a biting, relentless chill that found its way through the cracks in the buildings. Elijah was walking back to his boarding house, his coat collar turned up against the wind. The main street was mostly deserted, the amber light from the saloon windows spilling out in lonely patches. He saw her ahead of him, a solitary figure walking quickly, a thin shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. It was Clara. She was heading in the direction of the shabbier cabins that dotted the edge of town. He kept his distance, not wanting to frighten her. Then he saw them. 2 figures detached themselves from the shadows of the blacksmith's shop. They were big men, their shapes bulky and menacing in the dim light. They fell into step behind her, their pace quickening. Elijah recognized them as 2 of the men who had been with Bart Hannigan in the saloon the other night. Clara heard them. He saw her falter for a step, her head turning slightly, before she began to walk even faster. But the men broke into a lumbering run, closing the distance easily. One of them reached out and grabbed her shawl. "In a hurry, little songbird," one of them jeered. Elijah did not shout. He did not call out a warning. He was already moving, his long strides eating up the distance, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. Clara spun around, trying to pull her shawl free. "Leave me alone!" "Mr. Hannigan just wants to talk to you," the second man said, his grin a pale slash in the dark. "He's got a proposition for you, a real good one." He reached for her arm. That was when Elijah arrived. He did not slow down. He hit the first man like a freight train, his shoulder driving into the man's chest. The air left the man's lungs in a pained whoosh, and he staggered back, tripping over his own feet and landing hard in the dirt. The second man turned, startled, his hand dropping from Clara's arm. He fumbled for the pistol at his hip, but he was too slow. Elijah's fist connected with his jaw in a short, brutal arc. The sound was like a branch snapping. The man's head whipped to the side, and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even landed. The first man was scrambling to his feet, pulling his own gun. Elijah kicked it out of his hand, the pistol skittering away into the darkness. He grabbed the man by the front of his shirt, hauled him upright, and slammed him against the rough timber wall of the blacksmith's shop. "Go back to Hannigan," Elijah said, his voice a low, chilling growl. The quiet control of the saloon completely gone, replaced by something cold and deadly. "You tell him that if he or any of his men ever touch her again, I will burn his whole world to the ground. You tell him I said that." He punctuated the sentence by slamming the man's head against the wall again, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to make his point clear. He let the man go, and he collapsed into a whimpering heap. Elijah turned his back on him and walked over to where Clara stood, frozen, her eyes wide with shock and fear. The man on the ground scrambled up and ran, dragging his unconscious friend with him into the shadows. "Are you all right?" Elijah asked, his voice returning to its normal, quiet register. She was trembling, but not from the cold. She stared at the spot where the men had been, then looked at him, her face pale in the moonlight. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. "Do you know what you've done?" "I know," he said. "He will make you pay for this," she said, her voice shaking. "He will make us both pay. You should not have made trouble." A bitter, weary anger tightened Elijah's jaw. He looked at her frightened face, at the town that lay dark and silent around them, a town that allowed this to happen. "Trouble was already here," he said, his voice harsh. "It was here long before I rode in. It was waiting for you in this alley." Her face crumpled, the fight going out of her. He was right, and she knew it. She wrapped her arms around herself, a small, fragile gesture against a world of hurt. "Let me see you home," he said, his tone softening. She hesitated, then gave a small, defeated nod. They walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of their boots in the dust and the mournful sigh of the wind. Her cabin was a small, mean thing at the very edge of town, little more than a shack. It looked lonely and cold. When they reached her door, she fumbled with the key, her hands still shaking. "I had a dream once," she said suddenly, her back still to him. Her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it over the wind. "I was going to go to Chicago. I read about it in a book. The theaters, the lights. I was going to sing on a real stage, wear silk dresses. I dreamed a man would come listen to me every night, a gentleman. He would bring me flowers, and he would look at me without any shame." She finally got the door open and slipped inside, closing it softly behind her, leaving Elijah standing alone in the cold night with the ghost of her broken dream. He did not see her the next day, but that night he was back in the saloon. When she walked onto the stage, her eyes scanned the crowd and found his. She held his gaze for a long moment before turning to the piano player. She did not sing one of her usual sad ballads. She sang a slower song, one he had never heard before. It was a song about a stubborn root holding fast in dry ground, about a single star burning in a dark sky. It was a song of survival, and as she sang, her eyes kept coming back to his, a silent conversation taking place across the smoky room. The tension was a palpable thing, a current that flowed between his shadowed corner and the small, bright stage. When her set was over, she did not go back to collecting glasses. She walked directly to his table. She stood before him, her hands clasped in front of her, her chin held high. The noise of the saloon seemed to fade into a dull roar around them. "You don't have to look at me like I'm already broken," she said, her voice low but clear, laced with a defiant pride that took his breath away. Elijah looked up at her, at the strength in her jaw, the fire that was rekindling in her green eyes, the fierce dignity she wore like armor. He thought of the girl who dreamed of Chicago, and the woman who scrubbed floors with bloody knuckles. He thought of the stories the town told about her, and the story she told herself with every song she sang. He shook his head slowly, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "Maybe," he replied, his voice soft, meant only for her. "Maybe I don't see a broken thing at all." She stared at him, her lips parted slightly, as if she did not know what to do with his words. No one had ever said such a thing to her. No one had ever looked past the shame the town had branded her with. A flush rose on her cheeks, and she turned and walked away before he could see the tears that had sprung to her eyes. Later that night, as the crowd began to thin, Elijah stepped outside into the alley for a breath of cold, clean air. He stood in the deep shadows near the back, letting the quiet settle over him. He was about to go back inside when he heard voices from the other end of the alley, near the saloon's back entrance. It was Bart Hannigan, and he had Clara cornered against the wall. You think your new friend can protect you?" Hannigan was snarling, his voice a low, vicious hiss. He had her pinned, one hand braced on the wall next to her head. "He's a drifter. He'll be gone in a week, but I will still be here, and you will still be here, and you will do what I tell you to do." "Get away from me, Bart," Clara said, her voice trembling but full of hate. "I have a business associate coming to town," Hannigan went on, ignoring her. "A man from the railroad. He's very important, and he likes pretty things. I told him all about my pretty little songbird. You're going to be very, very nice to him. You understand me?" Elijah's hand went to the butt of his pistol. Every instinct screamed at him to step out of the shadows, to put an end to this right now. The rage he had felt in the street the night before came roaring back, hot and blinding. But he held himself back. He was one man. Hannigan owned the town, the sheriff, and he was now certain, a killer like Jed Tucker. A public fight would get him killed or run out of town, and it would leave Clara in a worse position than before. He was a hunter, and a hunter knew the value of patience. He knew you did not spring the trap until you were certain of the kill. He forced himself to stay still, a predator in the dark, watching, listening, and hating. He watched as Hannigan leaned in close, whispering something vile in her ear that made her flinch. Then Hannigan laughed, a short, ugly sound, and walked away, melting back into the saloon. Clara remained pressed against the wall for a long time, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking. Elijah stayed hidden in the shadows, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest, his promise to the man he had beaten echoing in his own mind. He would not just make Hannigan pay, he would burn his whole world to the ground. The air in Gallows Hollow grew colder, sharpened by a wind that carried the first bite of winter down from the high peaks. The mood of the town soured with the weather. Elijah's intervention at the saloon, followed by the beating of two of Bart Hannigan's men, had curdled the town's simmering resentment into open suspicion. Whispers followed him down the muddy street like burrs clinging to a saddle blanket. He was no longer just a stranger. He was a disruption, a stone thrown into a stagnant pond, and the ripples were making everyone uneasy. The stares he received were hard and unforgiving. The townsfolk, long accustomed to the rhythms of Hannigan's rule, saw him not as a savior but as a threat to their fragile, miserable peace. They looked from him to Clara, their gazes heavy with accusation, and the rumors they spun were ugly and predictable. They said he was trying to claim the saloon singer for himself, that he was just another man looking to own a broken thing. One afternoon, as Elijah left the general store, Sheriff Cutler stepped out from his office and blocked his path. Cutler was a man who looked permanently weary, his gut straining the buttons of his vest, his eyes dulled by years of compromise. "A word, friend," the sheriff said, his tone suggesting they were anything but. Elijah stopped, his hand resting casually on the saddlebag slung over his shoulder. He waited. "I run a quiet town here," Cutler said, a lie so blatant it was almost impressive. "Folks here, they don't take kindly to outside agitators. They like things the way they are." "Is that what they like?" Elijah asked, his voice flat. Cutler's eyes narrowed. "You're stirring up trouble where it ain't needed. I heard what you did to a couple of Mr. Hannigan's boys. That's a good way to find yourself at the bottom of a mine shaft with a broken neck." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Whatever business brought you to Gallows Hollow, I suggest you finish it and move on. You weren't sent here to fix anyone, especially not her." Elijah's gaze remained steady. Unreadable as granite, he did not confirm or deny anything. He simply looked at the sheriff, a long, measuring stare that seemed to see every rotten compromise the man had ever made. Without another word, he stepped around the sheriff and continued down the street, the unspoken threat hanging in the cold air between them. 2 days later, the threat took on a face. It was the face of a man named Miller, a rancher who had a small plot of land a few miles up the valley. Elijah saw the commotion from the window of his boarding house room. One of Hannigan's wagons was parked in front of the Miller homestead, a sorry-looking cabin that was more grit than timber. Two of Hannigan's thugs were hauling furniture out of the house and dumping it unceremoniously in the mud. Miller stood beside the growing pile of his worldly possessions, his face a mask of helpless fury. His cheek was swollen and bruised, a dark purple stain against his pale skin. His wife stood beside him, clutching a small, red-cheeked girl who was crying silently into her mother's skirt. The girl held a small rag doll with button eyes. Sheriff Cutler was there, watching, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression one of profound indifference. He was the law, and he was doing nothing. Elijah felt a hot, tight coil of rage in his gut. He saw the little girl with her rag doll, and for a heart-stopping second, he saw his son, Thomas. He saw the fear in the woman's eyes, and he saw Sarah, his hand clenched into a fist at his side, the knuckles white. He wanted to go down there, to draw his gun, to end this brutal theater of greed, but he knew it would be a fool's errand. They would kill him, and nothing would change for the Millers. He was one man, and Hannigan's power was a sickness that had infected the entire town. He watched until the wagon was loaded, until Miller and his family were forced to start walking down the road with nothing but the clothes on their backs, their home no longer their own. The law had watched it all happen. That evening, Elijah packed his few belongings. He could not stay in Mrs. Gable's house any longer, could not breathe the same air as the people who would stand by and watch a family be destroyed. He paid the woman what he owed her and left, walking toward the edge of town where a handful of derelict cabins stood empty, abandoned by prospectors who had given up the ghost. He found one that was still sound, its roof mostly intact. It was little more than a single room with a stone fireplace and a floor of packed earth. But it was honest. It did not pretend to be anything other than a shelter from the cold. He swept it out, gathered firewood, and by nightfall, he had a small, crackling fire pushing back the darkness. He was sitting on a crate, staring into the flames, when a soft knock came at the door. His hand instinctively went to the pistol at his hip. He moved to the door, his steps silent. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice low. "It's Clara." He hesitated for a long moment. He was not sure he wanted company, not sure he had anything to offer but his own grim silence. But he opened the door. She stood on the threshold, a tin coffee pot in one hand and 2 mugs in the other. Her shawl was pulled tight around her, and the cold had brought a touch of color to her cheeks. Her eyes were shadowed, full of a sorrow that seemed to match his own. "I saw you leave the boarding house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw what happened to the Millers. I thought you might want some coffee." He looked at the pot, then back at her face. He saw the effort the simple gesture had cost her, the courage it took to seek him out, to step out of the role the town had assigned her. He stepped back and held the door open wider. She slipped inside, bringing with her the scent of coffee and the cold night air. The cabin was small, and they moved around each other with a careful, unspoken awareness. She set the pot on the hearth to keep it warm and poured the coffee into the 2 mugs. She handed one to him, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting instant. The touch was like a spark in the cold room. They did not speak for a long time. They sat on 2 upended crates near the fire, sipping the hot, bitter coffee, the silence stretching between them. It was not an awkward silence, but a heavy one, filled with all the things they had seen and all the things they could not say. "It happens all the time," Clara said finally, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "The land, the water, the women. The Hannigans take what they want, and everyone looks the other way." "Why do you stay?" Elijah asked, his voice rough. She gave a short, bitter laugh. "Where would I go? I have nothing, no family. This is all I have." She looked around the bare cabin, then back at the fire. "I used to hate this town. Now, I think I just hate the people in it." She fell silent again, tracing the rim of her mug with her finger. "A man came through here last year," she said, her voice dropping, becoming thin and brittle. "A politician from back east, looking to invest in the mine. He was important, respected. He came to the saloon every night. He said he liked my singing." Elijah watched her, his expression unreadable, his body unnaturally still. He knew this kind of story. "He was charming," she went on, a tremor in her voice. "He said all the right things. One night, after I was done singing, he asked me to his room for a private drink, to discuss a job offer in a real theater in Denver. I was a fool. I thought it was my chance." She took a shaky breath. "He did not want to talk about singing. When I tried to leave, he wouldn't let me." She stopped, unable to go on, her knuckles white where she gripped the mug. Elijah did not fill the silence with platitudes. He did not offer her pity. Pity was cheap. He waited, giving her the space to own her story. "I fought," she whispered, her voice thick with a shame that was not hers to carry. "But he was too strong. Afterward, I went to Sheriff Cutler. I told him what happened." She looked up at Elijah, and he saw the full, devastating depth of her pain in her green eyes. "He didn't believe me. No one did. They looked at me like I was a liar. They looked at me like I had gotten what I deserved. A saloon girl. What else could I expect?" The fire crackled, spitting a shower of sparks up the chimney. Elijah set his mug down on the dirt floor. He reached out, not to touch her, but just to let his hand rest on the crate between them. A silent offering of support. "I believe you," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the small cabin with the force of a thunderclap. Clara stared at him, her lips parted. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She had been carrying this story alone for a year, a poison in her soul, and in 2 simple words, he had given her something she thought she would never have again: validation. He let the silence settle again before he spoke, his own voice low and filled with a gravelly pain. 9 years ago, I had a wife. Her name was Sarah, and a son, Thomas. He was 5 years old. Now it was her turn to be still, to listen. I built our cabin myself, on a piece of land just south of the Cimarron. It was good land. We were happy. He looked into the fire, but he was seeing another fire, a bigger, hungrier one. I was out hunting. A band of raiders came through. They wanted the horses, the food. They wanted whatever they could take. Sarah, she must have tried to fight them. They set fire to the cabin, with her and the boy still inside. His voice was a monotone, a recitation of facts he had gone over in his mind 1,000 times. I saw the smoke from miles away. By the time I got back, it was too late. The whole world was on fire. I could hear them. I could hear them screaming. He fell silent, his throat working. The memory was a physical thing, a hand squeezing his heart. I found what was left of the men who did it, he continued, his voice now a dead, empty thing. It took me a year, but it didn't change anything. It didn't bring them back. It didn't make the screaming stop. He looked at his own hands, large and calloused. I dug the grave myself, with these 2 hands. There wasn't much to bury. He finally looked at her, and his gray eyes were not the eyes of a hardened gunman. They were the eyes of a man who had lost everything, a man who had been hollowed out by a grief so profound it had become a part of him. They sat there, 2 people bound by the ghosts of their past, the air in the small cabin thick with shared sorrow. The fire burned low, and the chill of the night began to creep back into the room. Clara shivered, and without thinking, Elijah rose and put another log on the embers. He took the thin blanket from his bedroll and draped it over her shoulders. She did not go back to the saloon. The hours slipped by, and still she stayed, as if she were afraid to go back out into the cold, cruel world. The fire burned down to glowing coals, and the cabin was filled with a deep, profound silence. She stood up, the blanket still wrapped around her. She looked small and fragile in the dim, flickering light. She took a step toward him, then another. She stopped just before him, her face tilted up to his. She was trembling. "Don't you want me?" she asked, and the question was the most terrifying and vulnerable thing he had ever heard. It was not a seduction. It was not an offer. It was a raw, fearful plea. After everything she had been through, after everything the world had told her she was asking him if she was still worthy of being wanted. Elijah had been cleaning his rifle, the familiar weight of it a comfort in his hands. The oil, the steel, the wood. This was the world he knew. This was the tool he used to keep the world at bay, the barrier he kept between his dead heart and the living. He heard her question, and it went through him like a bullet, shattering the ice that had encased his soul for 9 years. He looked at her, at the hope and the fear warring in her eyes. He slowly, deliberately, put the rifle down, leaning it against the wall. The sound of the metal butt against the stone hearth was loud in the silence. He crossed the small space between them. He raised a hand, his fingers calloused and rough from the reins and the gun. He hesitated for a breath, then gently, so gently, he touched her hair. He let his fingers sink into the soft, honey-colored strands. A simple, reverent touch. It was an answer. He did not kiss her. He did not lead her to his bedroll. He simply drew her in, wrapping his arms around her, pulling the blanket tight. He held her as she began to cry. Silent, racking sobs that shook her entire body. He just held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, his eyes closed against the darkness. He held her through the long, cold hours of the night. 2 survivors clinging to a piece of wreckage in a stormy sea. It was not ownership. It was not lust. It was something far more desperate and far more human. A new connection, forged in the ashes of their old lives. The next day, Elijah was a man with a new purpose. He left a sleeping Clara in the cabin, a fresh fire burning in the hearth. He moved through the woods at the edge of town like a wraith, watching the Hannigan mine. His patience was rewarded. He saw one of Hannigan's foremen meet a man in a clearing. The man had a mean, rat-like face and a pale, ugly scar that cut through his right eyebrow. It was Jedediah Tucker. He was alive, and he was on Hannigan's payroll. That afternoon, Clara returned to the Golden Spur. She had to work. She had to survive. As she was cleaning glasses behind the bar, she heard Mr. Sterling, the saloon owner, talking in a low voice to Bart Hannigan in his office. The door was ajar, and she could hear every word. "The man from the railroad, Mr. Ambrose. He'll be here on the evening stage tomorrow." Hannigan was saying, "Make sure your girl is ready for him. I promised him a memorable welcome. He has a weakness for singers." The blood drained from Clara's face. The vague threat in the alley had become a concrete plan. He was going to sell her, like a horse or a bottle of whiskey, to a visiting investor. Her time in Gallows Hollow had just run out. The news that Bart Hannigan intended to gift her to a railroad investor landed in Clara's soul like a shovelful of cold earth on a coffin. The vague, looming threat had become a date on a calendar, an appointment with damnation. She fled the saloon as soon as her shift was over, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and ran through the cold, dark streets to the one place that felt like a sanctuary, Elijah's cabin. He was waiting for her, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He had seen Tucker. He knew the bounty he was hunting was now the muscle behind the man who was tormenting her. The 2 separate threads of their troubles had twisted together into a hangman's knot. "You have to leave, Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent. Before she even had a chance to speak, he had already come to the same conclusion. "I saw Tucker today. He's working for Hannigan. This is going to get ugly. There's a stage that leaves at dawn, heading east. I'll give you all the money I have. You get on it and you don't look back." His words were meant to be a lifeline, but to her, they sounded like a judgment. He was offering her the same solution the world always offered women like her: run and hide, disappear. She stood in the middle of the small room, her shawl clutched in her fists, and she shook her head. The movement was small, but it was filled with an iron certainty that surprised them both. "No!" Elijah's brow furrowed. He took a step toward her. "Clara, you don't understand. This man Ambrose, whoever he is, Hannigan isn't asking. He's telling. You know what will happen if you're still here tomorrow night." "I know," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "I've spent 5 years in this town letting men tell me what will happen. I've spent my whole life backing down." She looked at him, her green eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before, a fire he had helped to kindle. "This place, it took my father in that mine. It took my name and sold it to pay his debts. It took my voice and made it sing for scraps. It's not taking anything else." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I'm not running again." He saw the unshakable resolve in her face, and a part of him, the part that had seen her scrub floors with bleeding hands, felt a surge of admiration, but the part of him that still heard the screams of his wife and son in his dreams was terrified. He had failed to protect them. He would not fail again. "This is not a fight you can win," he said, his voice hard with desperation. "This isn't about pride. It's about survival." "What kind of survival?" she shot back, her voice rising. "To run to another town, find another saloon, and wait for another man like Bart Hannigan? To always be looking over my shoulder, always be the fallen woman who has to start over? No, the running stops here. Win or lose, it stops here." He stared at her, caught between his instinct to protect and her fierce will to fight. He saw that he could drag her to the stagecoach, but he could not make her leave. Her spirit had finally taken root, and it would not be torn from this poisoned ground. For the next 24 hours, a quiet, desperate war was waged in Gallows Hollow. Elijah's war was one of observation. He watched the Hannigan mine. He watched the sheriff's office. He watched the saloon, trying to map the enemy's movements, trying to find a weakness in the fortress of greed and fear that Hannigan had built. Clara's war was quieter, but far more dangerous. She began to move through the hidden corners of the Golden Spur not as a victim, but as a conspirator. She sought out the other women who worked there, the ones who served the drinks, who cleaned the rooms, who endured the groping hands and whispered propositions. She found them in the laundry room, their hands red and raw in the hot water. In the narrow kitchen, the air thick with the smell of grease and stale beer. In the cramped attic room they shared, where they slept in narrow cots. She spoke to them in hushed tones, her voice a low, urgent current beneath the saloon's raucous noise. At first, they were terrified. They looked at her with wide, frightened eyes, shaking their heads, whispering for her to be silent. She found Rosie, a young woman barely 17 with the perpetually startled look of a fawn, polishing glasses behind the bar. "He can't keep doing this to us," Clara whispered, her back to the main room. "He'll kill us, Clara," Rosie breathed, her hands trembling so badly that the glass rattled against the bar. "If he finds out we're even talking about this." "He's already killing us, Rosie," Clara said, her voice fierce. "A little piece every day. Don't you feel it? Don't you want it to stop?" She told them about the politician, about the shame, about the silence. And in her story, they saw their own. They saw the foreman who cornered them in the storeroom, the miner who thought $1 bought their body as well as their time, the casual cruelty of Bart Hannigan, who treated them like his personal property, one by one, hesitantly. They began to talk, a whispered story here, a tearful confession there. They spoke of threats, of abuses, of promises made and broken. Clara did not write anything down. She committed every story, every name, every painful detail to memory. She was gathering ammunition. She was building an army out of broken women. Elijah, frustrated and seeing no other path, decided to force the issue. If the town's conscience was dead, he would try to shock it back to life. He walked into the sheriff's office in the middle of the afternoon. Cutler was where he always was, tilted back in his chair, a half-empty bottle on his desk. "Miller and his family," Elijah said, dispensing with any preamble. He stood in the center of the room, his presence filling the small, dusty space. "You just let Hannigan's men throw them off their land." Cutler slowly brought his chair down to the floor with a groan. He eyed Elijah with open hostility. "That was a legal matter, Mr. Miller was behind on his lease payments to the Hannigan Mining Company." "His lease payments were raised threefold last month," Elijah countered, his voice dangerously calm. "After he refused to sell. You and I both know what that was." "I know my job," Cutler sneered. "And it ain't to question the business of the man who signs my paychecks. I told you to leave this town. You're still here." "I'm here to collect a bounty on Jedediah Tucker," Elijah said, playing a card he hoped might have some effect. "He's wanted for murder, and he's working for Bart Hannigan. Are you going to do your job and help me arrest him?" A flicker of something, was it fear, passed through the sheriff's eyes before he masked it with a bluff smile. "Tucker, ain't seen him. If I did, I'd arrest him myself." "You're a liar," Elijah said, the words falling like chips of ice. "You're a coward. You're letting this town die so you can line your pockets with Hannigan's dirty money." Cutler's face turned a blotchy red. He surged to his feet, his hand dropping to his gun. "That's enough. You get out of my office. You get out of my town. This is your last warning." Elijah held the sheriff's gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked out, the air crackling with unspoken violence. He knew he had gained nothing, but he had declared his intentions. The line had been drawn. The consequences came that night. He was walking back to his cabin, the street empty under a cold sliver of a moon. He heard a footstep behind him and was turning, his hand reaching for his Colt, when something hard and heavy crashed into the side of his head. The world exploded in a shower of white-hot stars, and he fell to his knees, his senses reeling. Before he could recover, they were on him. There were 3 of them, their faces obscured by shadows. But he recognized the mean, rat-like silhouette of Jed Tucker. A boot slammed into his ribs, driving the air from his lungs. He tried to fight, to get to his feet, but another blow sent him sprawling into the mud. "The sheriff sends his regards," Tucker's voice rasped above him. "And Mr. Hannigan, they said to tell you that Gallows Hollow doesn't appreciate meddlers." They were brutally efficient. They did not waste time with words. It was a merciless, calculated beating. Fists and boots rained down on him, a storm of pain. He tasted blood and mud. He felt a rib crack. A kick to the head made the world swim and blur. He tried to protect his head, but a final, vicious kick connected with his temple, and the world dissolved into a roaring, black abyss. They left him lying there, a broken heap in the middle of the street, to be found or to die. It was Clara who found him. She had been waiting in his cabin, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach as the hours passed. When he did not return, she could not bear it any longer. She pulled on her shawl and stepped out into the night, her heart pounding with a terrible premonition. She found him halfway down the main street. A strangled cry escaped her lips. For a moment, she was frozen, the sight of his still battered form paralyzing her. Then, a fierce, protective instinct took over. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees in the cold mud. She felt for a pulse in his neck. It was there, faint and thready, but it was there. She was not a large woman, and he was a heavy man, all bone and muscle. But desperation gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. She hooked her arms under his, and she began to drag him. It was a slow, agonizing process. She strained every muscle, her feet slipping in the mud, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She pulled him, inch by painstaking inch, out of the street and into the shadows, toward the sanctuary of the cabin. Inside, she managed to haul him onto the narrow bedroll. In the dim light of the fire, she saw the full extent of the damage. His face was a swollen, bloody mask. A deep gash on his temple was still weeping blood. His shirt was torn, and she could already see the dark, angry bruises forming on his chest and ribs. She worked with a frantic energy, her fear fueling her. She tore strips from one of her petticoats, her hands shaking. She cleaned the cuts on his face with water from the bucket, her touch as gentle as she could make it. She pressed a clean cloth to the gash on his temple, trying to stem the bleeding. He was unconscious for hours, lost in a world of pain. He mumbled in his delirium, fragments of words she could not understand. He tossed and turned, his body slick with a feverish sweat. She stayed by his side, bathing his face with cool water, whispering his name, willing him to come back to her. Sometime before dawn, his eyes flickered open. They were glassy with fever, and they did not seem to recognize her at first. He tried to sit up, a groan of pure agony escaping his lips. "Easy," she whispered, pressing him gently back down. "Lie still." He blinked, and his gaze slowly came into focus. He saw her face, pale and strained with worry, her hair falling from its pins, her dress stained with his blood. "Clara," he rasped, his voice a broken thing. "I'm here," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. He looked at her, and the fever seemed to burn away the walls he kept around his heart, leaving him raw and exposed. "You make me feel alive," he confessed, the words a rough, painful whisper. "For the first time in years, I feel alive." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. They were the most beautiful and most terrifying thing anyone had ever said to her. He was not just a protector, not just an ally. He was a man who was beginning to feel again, and she was the reason. She broke then. The tears she had been holding back streamed down her face. She leaned over him, her own whispered confession a prayer in the dim light. "Then don't leave me," she pleaded, her voice choked with a lifetime of fear and abandonment. "Don't you leave me like the rest." He was too weak to answer. His eyes slipped closed again, and he fell back into a fevered sleep. The next few days passed in a blur of slow, painful recovery. Clara did not go to the saloon. She did not leave the cabin. Her world shrank to the size of that small room, to the man lying on the bedroll. She fed him broth when he could eat, spooning it carefully into his mouth. She changed his bandages. She kept the fire burning, a constant, warm presence against the encroaching cold. Slowly, he began to heal. The fever broke, the swelling on his face went down, leaving behind a constellation of dark, ugly bruises. He began to talk, his voice still weak but clear. In the long hours of his recovery, they shared small joys that felt like monumental victories. The first time he was able to sit up on his own, leaning against the cabin wall. The first time he tasted the soup she made and managed a small, pained smile. The first time she was telling a story about a particularly tone-deaf miner, and he let out a short, rough bark of laughter that made him wince. But it was laughter all the same. They felt like a family. It was a fragile, wounded imitation of one, but it was more than either of them had had in a very long time. The cabin became their entire world, a fortress against the ugliness outside. One night, a week after the beating, he was sitting up by the fire, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He was still weak, but the light was back in his eyes. Clara was sitting across from him, mending a tear in his shirt, her needle flashing in the firelight. The silence was comfortable, easy. He reached out and took her hand, the one that was not holding the needle. His touch was warm and steady. She stopped her sewing and looked at him. In his eyes, she saw a question and a depth of feeling that needed no words. Later that night, they made love. It was a slow, tender discovery, an act not of lust but of profound acceptance. He moved with a careful reverence, as if she were something precious he was afraid of breaking. He traced the faint scars on her back with his fingertips, not in judgment, but in silent understanding. She laid her hand on his shoulder, on the old, puckered burn scar he had from the fire that had taken his family. a touch that acknowledged his pain without asking him to speak of it. In the warm, fire-lit darkness of the cabin, they saw each other fully for the first time, not as the stoic gunman and the fallen saloon singer, but as two lonely, wounded people who had found a reason to feel again. They came together not to forget their scars, but to finally accept them as part of who they were. The next morning, Elijah woke to an empty bedroll. For a heart-stopping second, panic seized him. He sat up, his healing ribs protesting, and saw her across the room, fully dressed, tucking a piece of folded paper under the cinch of his saddle, which was resting on a crate. She turned and saw that he was awake. Her expression was a mixture of love, fear, and grim determination. She walked back to him, knelt down, and kissed him softly. "I have to go to work," she whispered. "Mr. Ambrose arrives tonight." Before he could protest, before he could tell her it was madness, she slipped out the door and was gone. He got up, his body aching, and walked over to the saddle. He pulled the folded paper from under the cinch. He opened it. Her handwriting was neat and clear. It was not a suicide note. It was a battle plan. It detailed her idea to trap Hannigan, to use his own greed and the arrival of the railroad investor against him, to get him to confess his crimes where others could bear witness. It was dangerous. It was desperate. It was brilliant. He read the letter, then read it again. He was torn. His every instinct screamed at him to go after her, to lock her in the cabin, to throw her on his horse and ride until Gallows Hollow was nothing but a bad memory. He had to protect her. But as he looked at the words on the page, he saw not a victim to be protected, but a soldier heading into battle. The woman he had come to love was not asking for his permission. She was trusting him with her plan. She was letting him choose his part in her war. The evening stagecoach arrived, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled slowly in the cold, twilight air. With it came Mr. Ambrose, a man whose tailored Eastern suit and polished boots were an affront to the town's gritty decay. He was stout and florid, with small, shrewd eyes that appraised everything: the saloon, the miners, the women, with the detached air of a man calculating profit and loss. Bart Hannigan greeted him on the saloon porch, his smile wide and predatory. Inside, the Golden Spur was buzzing with a nervous energy. Clara stood on the small stage, her hands clasped in front of her, her face a pale oval in the smoky lantern light. She wore her best dress, the dark blue velvet, mended and brushed. She had pinned her hair up with care. To any casual observer, she was simply the saloon singer, preparing for another night's performance. But beneath the calm exterior, her heart beat a frantic, desperate rhythm. In a small storeroom adjoining Hannigan's office, Rosie and two other women were hidden, huddled in the dark, a ledger book and a piece of charcoal clutched in their trembling hands. When Mr. Ambrose entered, escorted by Hannigan, a hush fell over the room. Clara met his eyes across the crowd. She took a slow, deep breath, and she began to sing. She did not choose one of her usual mournful ballads. She sang a song that was older, a haunting melody about a siren on the rocks, luring a ship to its doom. Her voice, pure and clear, wrapped around the notes, filling the saloon with a sound that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. She did not sing to the crowd. She sang to one man. Every note, every sorrowful phrase, every ounce of longing in the melody was a silken thread cast directly at the man from the railroad. She was the siren, and Gallows Hollow was her rock. Mr. Ambrose was captivated. He watched her, his head tilted, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across his face. He was a collector of fine things, and he had just spotted a new acquisition. When the song ended, his applause was the loudest in the room. For the next hour, Clara played her part. She served drinks at his table, enduring his patronizing compliments and the way his eyes roamed over her. She smiled her practiced, empty smile, all the while feeling the weight of the hidden women's hopes and the cold dread of what was to come. Finally, Hannigan, beaming with satisfaction, leaned over to Ambrose. "She's a special one, isn't she? As I promised. Why don't you two get better acquainted? My office is just through there. It's quiet." This was the moment. Ambrose rose, his eyes gleaming. He held out his arm to Clara. "My dear." Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she took his arm, her touch light and cool. "Of course, Mr. Ambrose," she said, her voice a soft murmur. She led him away from the crowded main room, toward the heavy oak door of Hannigan's office. She could feel every eye in the saloon on her back. Inside, the office was a different world. A thick carpet covered the floor. A large mahogany desk stood against one wall, and the air smelled of cigar smoke and expensive whiskey. It was the den of the wolf. "A drink," Ambrose offered, moving to the decanter on the desk. "No, thank you," Clara said, remaining by the door. "Mr. Hannigan said you had a business proposition for me." Ambrose chuckled, pouring himself a generous measure. "He did, indeed. He tells me you're looking for a new patron, someone who can appreciate your talents more fully. Our railroad is expanding. A man in my position needs a hostess, a companion, in the private car. It's a life of luxury, my dear. Silk dresses, fine food. All you have to do is keep me entertained." He took a sip of whiskey, his eyes appraising her like livestock. "Hannigan assures me you are very accommodating." Clara's blood ran cold, but she kept her voice steady. "And what arrangement did you and he come to? I would like to know the terms of my own sale." His smile widened. He was enjoying this. "Blunt, I like that. The terms are simple. I make a significant investment in his mine, securing his family's future. In return, he provides me with certain local assets, water rights, land deeds from some uncooperative ranchers. And you..." Behind the thin wall of the storeroom, a piece of charcoal scratched furiously against paper. "So I am just another asset," Clara said, her voice quiet. "Like a deed to a piece of land." "A much prettier one," Ambrose said with a leer. "Hannigan has a talent for clearing obstacles. He mentioned he had to persuade several landowners, and he keeps his women in line. He promised me you would be no trouble at all." Clara took a step back. "He threatened them? He threatened the women here?" Ambrose waved a dismissive hand. "Business is a rough game. My dear, now, I believe our negotiations are concluded." He set down his glass and started toward her. At that same moment, Bart Hannigan was walking past the storeroom door. He heard a faint sound, a muffled cough. He stopped, frowning. He put his ear to the door. He heard the whisper of cloth, the frantic scratching of the charcoal. A cold, sudden fury flooded his senses. He had been betrayed. He yanked the door open. Rosie and the other two women gasped, their faces illuminated in the spill of light from the hallway, the open ledger on their laps. Hannigan's face contorted in a mask of rage. He didn't waste a second on them. He turned and bellowed into the main room of the saloon. "Tucker, get in here now!" Jed Tucker and two of his men rose from their table, their chairs scraping loudly on the floor. "The singer!" Hannigan snarled, his voice shaking with fury. "She's in my office. Get her, and deal with anyone who gets in your way." Inside the office, Clara heard the commotion. Ambrose stopped, his head cocked. The doorknob began to turn. Clara's plan had worked, but the trap was closing on her as well. The main doors of the saloon burst open with such force that they slammed against the interior walls. Elijah stood there, framed against the dark night, a pistol in each hand. He was no longer the quiet, watchful drifter. He was a specter of vengeance, his bruised face set like stone, his gray eyes burning with a cold, lethal fire. The room fell into a deathly silence. Tucker and his men, halfway to the office, froze in their tracks. Elijah's gaze swept the room and found the office door, which was now open. He saw Clara's terrified face and the confused, angry face of Mr. Ambrose behind her. He saw Tucker, his hand hovering over his gun. "Get away from her!" Elijah's voice cut through the silence, low and hard as a hammer striking an anvil. Tucker sneered, recovering from the shock. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. I thought we taught you your lesson." He drew his gun. "This time we'll finish the job." He raised his pistol to fire at Elijah, but Elijah was faster. His right-hand gun bucked, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space. Tucker grunted, a red flower blooming on his shoulder, and he stumbled back. The saloon erupted into chaos. Guns roared, filling the air with a thick, acrid cloud of gunpowder smoke. Men screamed and dove for cover. Tables were overturned, and glass shattered. Elijah moved forward, firing with a calm, deadly precision, using a thick wooden pillar for cover. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, his movements fluid and economical. One of Tucker's men went down, clutching his leg. Elijah advanced, his eyes locked on Tucker, who was firing wildly now, the pain in his shoulder making him reckless. Clara, pulling a terrified Mr. Ambrose with her, scrambled out of the office, trying to find cover behind the long, heavy bar. Sheriff Cutler, who had been drinking at the far end of the bar, had drawn his own weapon, his face pale and beaded with sweat. For a long moment, he was paralyzed, caught between the man who paid him and the brutal violence erupting in front of him. He saw Tucker, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, take aim at Elijah's back as Elijah dealt with the third man. In that split second, something inside the sheriff finally broke. He saw the faces of the Millers, thrown off their land. He saw Clara's face, not as a fallen woman, but as a woman fighting for her life. He saw Elijah, a lone man standing against a tide of corruption that Cutler himself had allowed to fester. His conscience, long buried and thought dead, won its first and final battle. Cutler raised his pistol, his hand surprisingly steady, and fired. The bullet struck Jed Tucker square in the back. The wanted man's eyes went wide with surprise. He staggered forward, his gun falling from his grasp, and collapsed face first onto the sawdust-covered floor. He was dead. Bart Hannigan, who had been cowering near the stage, saw his hired gun fall. He saw the sheriff, his gun smoking, now aiming in his direction. A look of pure, animal panic crossed his face. He pulled a small derringer from his coat pocket and fired a wild shot into the melee as he scrambled for the back door. The bullet ricocheted off the bar and caught Clara in the arm. She cried out, a sharp cry of pain, and stumbled, clutching the wound. Elijah saw her fall. He finished the last of Hannigan's men and, ignoring the danger, rushed to her side. Blood was blooming through the sleeve of her velvet dress. "Clara!" Hannigan, clutching a wound in his own side where one of Elijah's stray shots had grazed him, disappeared out the back door into the night. The gunshots stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the frantic whispers of the terrified patrons. Townspeople, drawn by the sound of the gunfight, began to gather cautiously at the saloon doors, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. Elijah knelt beside Clara, his face a mask of concern. Without hesitation, he tore a long strip from the bottom of his own dusty coat and pressed it tightly against her wound. "It's just a graze," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're going to be all right." But Clara was not looking at her arm. She was looking at the crowd gathering in the doorway, at the faces of the people who had whispered about her, judged her, and condemned her. Supported by Elijah, she got to her feet, her body trembling but her eyes blazing. She took a step forward, her voice ringing out through the silent, smoky room. "Bart Hannigan did this!" she cried, her voice clear and strong. "He and his father have been bleeding this town dry for years. They drove the Millers from their home. They take what they want, and they hurt anyone who stands in their way." Rosie and the other women emerged from the storeroom, their face tear-streaked but resolute. They came and stood behind Clara, a small, defiant line.
"He hurts us,"
Rosie said, her voice small but finding its strength.
"He has for years. We were afraid to speak. We are not afraid anymore."
A murmur went through the crowd. The whispers were no longer about Clara. They were about Hannigan. The secret, festering wounds of the town were finally being exposed to the light. Sheriff Cutler walked over to the bar, where Mr. Sterling, the owner, was hiding. "The ledger," Cutler said, his voice a low command. "The one from your office storeroom. Get it." Sterling, his face ashen, scurried away and returned with the book, handing it to the sheriff. Cutler looked at the pages filled with the accounts Clara had gathered, a written testament to years of abuse and intimidation. He looked at the women standing together. He looked at Elijah, who was still holding the makeshift bandage to Clara's arm. At that moment, two men from the crowd dragged a whimpering, bleeding Bart Hannigan back through the saloon doors. They had caught him trying to sneak to the stables. Sheriff Cutler walked up to him, the ledger in his hand. For the first time in years, he stood tall, the badge on his chest seeming to shine a little brighter, backed by the weight of the crowd and the undeniable evidence. He was the law again. "Bartholomew Hannigan," he said, his voice loud and clear for all to hear. "I'm arresting you for assault, extortion, and for the murder of Jedediah Tucker, who died in the commission of a crime at your behest." A stunned cheer went up from the crowd. It was a sound that had not been heard in Gallows Hollow for a long, long time. In the midst of the noise and the relief, the world shrank until it was only the two of them. Elijah looked down at Clara, his heart aching with a feeling he thought had died with his family. He saw her courage, her strength, her fierce and beautiful spirit. He gently lifted her into his arms, cradling her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. She looked up at him, her eyes full of exhaustion, pain, and a dawning, brilliant hope. He bent his head, his lips close to her ear, and whispered the words that were the truest thing he had left to say. "I want you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just tonight, not just now." The dust of the gunfight settled, but a different kind of dust was stirred in its wake. The dust of old secrets, of long-held fears, and of buried resentments. In the weeks that followed, Gallows Hollow began to breathe again. The air, once thick with the oppressive weight of the Hannigan name, felt cleaner, lighter. With Bart Hannigan in a federal jail awaiting trial and his father's mining empire crumbling under the weight of his son's crimes, the grip of fear that had choked the town for so long was finally broken. A quiet, tentative peace began to take root in the rocky soil. The change was most visible at the Golden Spur Saloon. The name remained, a stubborn reminder of the town's past, but its soul was transformed. Mr. Sterling, the owner, having witnessed the brutal reality of his silent partnership with Hannigan, sold the establishment for a pittance to the very women who had been its property. Rosie, her eyes no longer holding the look of a startled fawn, but the steady gaze of a proprietor, now stood behind the bar. She ran the saloon as a partnership with the other women. The whiskey was the same, but the laughter was different. It was genuine. The music was still sometimes sad, but it was no longer the sound of despair. It was the sound of memory, of survival. Men who came in looking for the old cruelties were met with a united front of cold stares and were quickly shown the door. The Golden Spur was no longer a hunting ground. It was a sanctuary. Elijah did not stay in the derelict cabin where he and Clara had first found solace. It was a place of ghosts and painful memories. With his own hands, the same hands that had dug a grave so many years ago, he began to build on a small rise at the edge of town, overlooking a valley that was slowly coming back to life. He raised a new cabin. It was not large or grand, but it was sound. He cut the timber himself, notched the logs with a practiced, patient hand, and set a hearth with stones pulled from the nearby creek. He was not just building a shelter. He was building a foundation. He was building a home. Clara lived there with him, while he worked on the walls. She turned the small space into a life. She scrubbed the floors until the scent of pine filled the air. She stitched lace curtains from a bolt of fabric she bought at the general store, a small act of defiance against the years of grit and ugliness. The curtains were a frivolous, beautiful thing, and they were hers, her few precious books, once hidden away in her shabby shack, now sat proudly on the deep windowsill, their spines catching the morning sun. The cabin smelled of baking bread and wood smoke. Of him. He had not put away his guns. A man like Elijah could no more abandon his weapons than he could change the color of his eyes. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place. He took bounty work, collecting the price on the heads of men who, like Jed Tucker, preyed on the weak. But his range was smaller now. He never rode so far that he could not be back by nightfall. His work was no longer a flight from memory, but a means to an end, a way to protect the quiet life he was building, to ensure the peace of the home he always returned to. Every evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Clara would see the familiar silhouette of him and his horse, Dust, coming up the trail, and every evening, the tight knot of fear in her chest, a companion for so many years, would loosen just a little more. They did not talk much of the past. Their wounds were still too new, too tender to the touch. His nights were sometimes haunted by the smell of smoke and the sound of screams that were not there. Her sleep was sometimes broken by the phantom touch of a cruel hand, the echo of a jeering voice. They carried their scars, visible and invisible, like the rings of an old tree, but in the deep, quiet hours of the night, when the nightmares came, they would hold each other in the silence. His arms around her were a solid, grounding presence. Her hand on his chest was a steady anchor in the dark. They did not need words to say that they understood. They chose each other every morning when the sun rose, and every night when the darkness fell. It was a quiet, daily sacrament. One afternoon, the stage brought the mail. The station agent, a young man who now tipped his hat to Clara instead of looking through her, handed her a single, crisp envelope. The postmark was from Chicago. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp lurch. Her hands trembled as she took it back to the cabin. She sat at the small table Elijah had built, the lace curtains stirring in the breeze, and opened it. The letter was from a man named Silas Croft, a music agent. He wrote that a Mr. Ambrose, a railroad investor, had spoken in breathless terms of a singer with the voice of an angel he had heard in a forgotten town in the West. Mr. Croft was formally inviting her to Chicago for an audition. He was prepared to offer her a contract, a position in one of the city's finest musical halls. He wrote of tutelage, of elegant gowns, of a grand piano and a concert stage. She read the letter 3 times. Every word was a brushstroke, painting a perfect picture of the dream she had once confessed to Elijah in the dark. Chicago, a real stage. A man who would listen to her sing and see her as an artist. It was all there, on a piece of paper. A real and tangible offer. The girl she used to be, the girl who had cried for a life she thought was lost forever, was screaming inside her to say yes. She could leave. She could pack her few belongings, get on the next stagecoach, and never look back at the dust and the pain of Gallows Hollow. She could wash this town from her skin and reinvent herself in the bright lights of a city that had never heard the whispers, that had never seen her shame. She folded the letter and stood up. She walked to the open cabin door and looked out at the valley. She saw the new roof on the miller's homestead, the family having returned to their land with a new deed, signed by a town council that was no longer afraid. She saw the thin ribbon of smoke rising from the chimney of the saloon, where Rosie was likely counting the day's earnings. She saw the deep, familiar tracks that Elijah's horse made on the trail leading home. This place was scarred. It was harsh. But here, she was not a runaway. She was not a victim. Here, she was a survivor. Here, she was a hero. Here, she had a name that people said with respect. Here, she had a home. When Elijah returned that evening, He found her sitting on the porch, the letter resting in her lap. He saw the eastern postmark, and a shadow of concern crossed his face. He swung down from his horse and walked over to her, his spurs jingling softly. He did not ask what it was. He waited for her to tell him. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and calm. "It's from a music agent. In Chicago. He wants me to come sing for him. He's offering me a contract." Elijah's face remained impassive, but she saw the stillness in his body, the way his hands rested on his hips. He was bracing himself. He would not ask her to stay. He had never been a man to put another person in a cage, no matter how much he wanted to. He would let her go if that was what she wanted. She held up the letter. "This is the dream I told you about," she said softly. "It came true, just late." He nodded, his throat tight. She looked away from him, back out at the vast, empty prairie that stretched to the edge of the world. "I'm not going," she said. He let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. He sat down on the step beside her. "Why not?" he asked, his voice rough. "It's everything you wanted." She turned to him then, and her smile was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It was not the ghost of a smile she wore in the saloon. It was real, and it reached the depths of her green eyes. She placed her hand on his knee. "It's not everything I want, not anymore." She looked at the small, sturdy cabin, at the lace curtains, at the town nestled in the valley below. "This is the first place I was ever wanted," she said. "For who I am, not for what I could be, or what someone could take from me." She tore the letter into small, neat pieces and let the prairie wind take them, scattering the ghost of an old dream across the valley. The final scene of their story unfolded on an evening a week later, as the sky was painted in the fiery colors of a western sunset. Clara was on the porch, leaning against one of the posts, singing softly to herself. It was not a song for a crowd, not a performance. It was a simple, quiet tune, a melody that drifted on the wind and spoke of contentment, of peace found in an unlikely place. A few feet away, Elijah sat on the steps, sharpening the long blade of his hunting knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic, metallic scrape of steel on stone was a steady counterpoint to her gentle song. The wind was harsh, a constant, restless presence that whispered of hardship and the coming winter. But the light spilling from the open cabin door was warm, and inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, a beacon against the vast, encroaching darkness. He finished his work, testing the edge of the blade with his thumb. He wiped it clean on a piece of leather and sheathed it. He rose, his movements as silent and graceful as a shadow. He came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She stopped singing and leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. They stood like that for a long time, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear behind the distant mountains, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. "Don't you want me?" she whispered again, the words a soft echo of the terrified plea she had made in the dark of his broken-down cabin. But this time, the question was different. It was not born of fear or shame. It was a gentle, loving refrain, a quiet affirmation of the bond between them, as intimate and familiar as the warmth of his arms around her. Elijah did not answer right away. He tightened his hold, burying his face in the soft, clean scent of her hair. He breathed her in, a drowning man breathing air. He thought of the hollow, empty man he had been, a ghost haunting the memory of a life that had burned to the ground. He thought of her, the woman who had looked at him and seen something other than a killer, the woman who had shown him that a heart could be broken and still learn how to beat again. "I always did," he murmured, his voice a low, rough sound against her skin. "I just didn't believe I could have you." Thank you for listening to our story. Comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us.